guest this evening, Joel Pollak. Let me make sure he's with us. Hey, Joel.
Hello.
I got to make sure that we're also on Facebook. So I said we are. Okay. Thank you all very much for joining us. And Joel, thank you for joining me. And where are you joining us from?
I'm in Pacific Palisades, California, which is part of LA. If you're familiar with LA, it's right by the Pacific Ocean. Very nice place to live.
Have you been in lockdown? You're a senior editor at Breitbart. You're the author of the new book, Red November. We'll talk about all of that. But have you been going into the office? Have you been in lockdown?
We stopped going into the office about mid-March when the governor essentially told people to stay home unless they had essential travel. So we've all been working remotely. Not such a big challenge for us because most of our employees work remotely, but we do have an office here in LA, and we haven't gone in there for about, I guess, 10 weeks now. So we've been managing that as best we can, but we're doing fine.
Let me first say that my viewers know that I recently lost my father. It's slightly over 2 weeks. I traveled to Israel for my father's burial. That was a very painful thing. And Joel, you reached out to me. You and I have been friends for a long time, and I thank you very much for your words of comfort. You edit me with my columns on Breitbart, and you do an excellent job. So you and I have a professional relationship. We have a real deep friendship. We have a lot of shared objectives, especially when it comes to promoting American democracy and human rights, and defending Israel and promoting a democratic agenda in the Middle East, etc. So having you reach out to me meant a lot to me, and I've actually been overwhelmed at how many people have indeed contacted me in their thousands, tens of thousands. My family and I have been really overwhelmed. It's been very moving, but especially when it comes to people that I'm particularly close to. And the only reason that I seem a little bit distracted is I want to make sure that one last thing here works. Okay, good. Now it's working. Okay, so Joel, let's jump right into this. I have found it really hard to find solace and comfort amidst the personal tragedy. It's indescribable what it's like to lose a parent. My father had been ill for 5 months. We couldn't even see him the last almost 2 months because of the COVID lockdowns in the hospitals. And I'm in a period of mourning, and I love the United States. And I come back from Israel after burying my father on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, Judaism's holiest burial site, where you see the Temple Mount, and where, according to Jewish tradition, those who are buried there will be the first to greet the Messiah. Those that are buried there will be the very first to rise in the resurrection of the dead. And I come back to this great country that I love, the United States of America. And I've been telling my viewers that I actually found so much comfort in being an American, even after my parents' divorce. You know, our family split up. I was only 8 years old, but I was part of the United States of America, this country of great ethnicity, a multi-ethnic society, a country of differing political views and different ethnicities and different nationalities, all of whom cohered into creating the great American body politic. And then I come back to this country that's just torn asunder with the George Floyd murder, and then race demonstrations, which eventually became race riots. And I go around New York, and I was showing my viewers yesterday the boarded up stores. We saw many of the demonstrations. We saw a demonstration yesterday that was actually, it was unbelievable, because there were about 100 police officers from NYPD, and I'd say about a third of them were minority officers, including many African-American women wearing full riot gear, and they were staring very stoically at an activist that was pointing at them and calling them murderers and killers. And these were African-American women of the NYPD, and I still remember 19 years ago, after the 9/11 terror attacks, that the police were our greatest heroes. And I said to myself, how did we go from that and the NYPD, which has such a large minority presence, how did we go from that to the demonization of the police and even calling for the defunding of the police? I don't even know what that means. Does it mean that people will rob a bank and there'll be no consequences, no repercussions? So I do want to talk about racism. I know that you are phenomenally opposed to racism of any kind. I know that you're very dedicated to the universal Jewish teaching of every human being created in the image of God. But how did we go from that? Police were heroes. America is one country amidst some racial outrages that have to be, of course, called out by bad apples in the police force, et cetera. But how did we go from that to superimposing this demonization on the police and just seeing them as villains?
Well, the answer is politics. This has been a push from the left for quite some time, and it is at odds with the reality, which is that policing has been improving over time, and racism is less of a problem. I won't say it's not a problem, but it's less of a problem on the police force than it has been in years past. And this is a problem that has been addressed over and over again, can always be addressed more thoroughly, but this is something that nobody disagrees about. Everybody's on the same side of this one. We don't want to see the police use excessive force against anybody. We don't want to see anybody singled out because of their race. And we don't even want to see people dying by accident or being injured by accident. But these things happen, and there are ways to deal with that. In this case, a lot of the anger is political, in my view. You've had several years of demonization of the police by the left in this country. That was a deliberate decision taken with the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. And an entire narrative developed around this idea of hands up, don't shoot, that he was murdered while trying to surrender and he was facing away from the police officer, all of which was false. Obama's Department of Justice, which was headed by Eric Holder at the time, I believe, still Eric Holder, and had a real determination to find some kind of racism or civil rights violation, found that there wasn't one, and that some of the witnesses in this neighborhood, most of whom were African American, said they would have reacted the same way the police officer did. And yet we had this national outrage, and rioters, when the police officer was not indicted for murder, rioters burned businesses to the ground in Ferguson, including many minority-owned businesses. And this was never really addressed in any meaningful way. Instead, you had CNN anchors, people who ought to have known better, repeating this hands up, don't shoot gesture, the whole performative wokeness of it all. And this became a political issue, a way to organize the left. In much the way the Occupy Wall Street movement had been used by the left, there is a response that the left has, unfortunately, to losing elections, which is to organize riots or to organize protests that go as far over the line as they can. And they did it with Occupy Wall Street, and they did it with the Black Lives Matter movement, which had a disastrous result. We're learning now from the data that's coming up that Black Lives Matter forced police departments in some of the country's most dangerous cities to pull back from patrol work, pull back from ordinary policing, and that had a direct negative effect on Black lives, literally. Homicide rates went up, other crime rates went up, and it was done out of some genuine outrage at deaths that were unexplained, like Freddie Gray in Baltimore. That should not have happened. But in many cases, and well, there's also the other one, Eric Gardner in New York, who became not just a hero in a sense to Black Lives Matter, but also to small government conservatives, because he was being arrested for selling loose cigarettes on the street, which is something banned by the city administration to maximize tax revenue. So he was being taken in for violating a really petty regulation. It's the kind of regulation that libertarians and conservatives think shouldn't even exist. So there was a lot of empathy for him and outrage that the police acted so slowly and that the justice that came in that case came so long and so late. This has been different. Donald Trump was on the case as soon as George Floyd was unfortunately killed. The president called in the FBI and the DOJ. The Hennepin County prosecutor was on top of the case. Everything happened that you would want to see happen. It was evidence of a functioning system. The police officers were fired almost immediately. The arrest happened a short time later. And yet you had, after the president had already brought in the FBI and the DOJ, you had the starting of looting. in Minneapolis. And when it wasn't stopped in Minneapolis, people saw they could do it elsewhere. First in St. Paul, the city across from Minneapolis in Minnesota, and then throughout the country over the weekend that followed. And it was just frankly shocking, absolutely shocking to see these scenes of fairly well-to-do people, black, white, whatever, especially the white kids going into liquor stores and stealing things. They had no particular racial grievance, and some of them didn't even seem to be members of any kind of political organization, just going in and helping themselves to other people's things. And then you had the burning of the police precinct. So this spiraled out of control. A lot of it was due to politics. Now, I'm not saying that everybody involved had, a kind of left-wing allegiance or was going to vote Democratic, but I think there has definitely been a push among Democrats to demonize the police. And they demonize the police because it's easier to do that than to take responsibility for some of the lingering problems in inner city communities, problems that have actually improved. It's hard to even remember this, but in February, we had the lowest Black unemployment in the history of our country, or at least in 50 years. We also had the lowest poverty level among African Americans. I think it dropped to something like 20%, which was an historic low. And that was the result of policies that focused on economic growth. When you grow the economy and you free the market to create jobs, it makes everybody's lives better. Now, of course, there was an intervening event, which was the coronavirus pandemic. Coronavirus may be partly responsible in a way for some of the unrest we're seeing, because it took that great economy and suddenly stopped it. And if you look at the data, which we now have for the last few months, Black and Hispanic unemployment went up far more than white unemployment. And that wasn't the result of racial discrimination. It was the result of concentration of different population groups in different industries. Blacks and Hispanics are more concentrated, for example, in the restaurant industry. And the restaurant industry was hardest hit because that's where people congregate, that's where people get together. Restaurants were closed, were shut down. So we heard a lot of the stories about the owners of restaurants, many of whom are white. You didn't hear the stories about the workers so much. And actually, George Floyd, who was the victim in Minneapolis, worked at a restaurant, and he lost his job, or he was sent home or laid off because of the coronavirus. So George Floyd was one of those many restaurant workers in the minority community who was in economic dire straits because of the coronavirus. And you may have had an additional sense of frustration among minority communities because of the dashed expectations. The hardest thing for human beings to deal with is changing expectations, especially lowering expectations. And when people were looking forward to perhaps buying a new car, putting a down payment on a home, and suddenly that entire future is gone because the job is gone, even if you think you're going to get the job back, and they have the PPP loans and the stimulus checks and all that stuff, something deeply destabilizing has happened in people's lives. And there are also a lot of people sitting around with nothing to do, especially the young people who are out of school. So a lot of the people who were fomenting a lot of the riots and looting were younger. That's not to excuse any of it. And I have very, very strong feelings about that, if you want to get into that. But what happened was essentially partly caused by politics and partly triggered by this sudden economic crisis. There's one other element of the political side of this thing, which I think is important, and then I'll finish my answer. But the other part of it that's important is that we've had 4 years now of the demonization of this administration by the left. And it's not an ordinary form of political criticism. It's really a thorough undermining, not just of the president as a politician, but of basic ideas of governance, such as the idea that you accept the result of a democratic election, the idea that you're entitled to due process, that prosecutors don't spy on people who are innocent, that you turn over exculpatory evidence. I mean, all these things. The president was put through this impeachment process, which was completely cooked up, and he had no rights throughout the entire process until right at the end. So we've watched all of this happen. The country's been put into a state of almost kind of cold war with itself, cold civil war, for nothing, only because the Democratic Party has decided to reject the results of the 2016 election. And nothing they say happened. We now learn Michael Flynn was framed, that he didn't break the law. We learned that there was nothing impeachable in anything the president did, and so on and so forth. Roger Stone also, perhaps he committed some crimes, but the sentence he got was ridiculous. The arrest he had was ridiculous. This idea that police abuse their powers, something everybody can see in certain cases. If Roger Stone was preparing to turn himself in, his lawyer told the government he was going to walk into the FBI and turn himself in, and he was arrested in a pre-dawn raid with CNN somehow tipped off about it with their cameras rolling. That's not even a law enforcement issue as much as it is a Department of Justice prosecution issue. So there's a lot of prosecutorial conduct that needs to be looked into, or misconduct. But this political situation of a revolutionary fervor, which has gripped the country with the Black Lives Matter movement, was in a sense created by the Democratic Party, not specific to the issue of policing or racism, but really just about politics in general. And we've been living through this unnecessarily. And I was surprised at the start of the coronavirus how little goodwill there was in the Democratic side to put political differences aside and work together. No, they thought this was the opportunity to get Trump out of power, and they were disappointed when he succeeded with his response. I think the Democratic Party is in a very interesting, as a journalist, but also as a citizen, a very dangerous place right now.
Well, that's your book, Red November, which is being published next month, July, right? It's not out yet?
Right. It's available for pre-order at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and just about everywhere else. But yes, it comes out July 14th.
Okay. And I want to talk about the book, but let me now respond to some of the things that you said. You are very kind to me in that whenever I publish a column on Breitbart, it's almost always values-based. You know that as a rabbi, I don't get into a right and left divide. As a rabbi, I feel a moral responsibility to try to rise above any kind of political partisanship and try to find those values that unite right and left, those values that connect all Americans, that make us into the United States of America. So let's just trace those values back for a moment through the recent turmoil that has so impacted on the United States. In 2 nights' time, I'm going to be interviewing on Zoom and here on Facebook my very dear friend Peter Noel, and he and I were radio co-hosts on America's legacy Black radio station 1600 WWRL, 1600 AM here in New York City. I was the first ever white radio host on the station. It was an incredible 1 year, every morning, 6 to 10 a.m., 4 hours. Peter believes that America is a deeply racist society and a racist country. He lost his mother to the coronavirus. I just lost my father. He and I love each other very deeply. He's one of my dearest friends. He actually got married in my home. He's a very big critic of the state of Israel, et cetera, et cetera. But we love each other and we're very connected. He will say in 2 nights' time, as he told me today on the phone, that Shmuel, you have to accept that America is a deeply racist country. So what I said to him, look, Peter, what I certainly, of course, what is undeniable is that the United States has a terrible racial history. It's hard to believe it up until 150 years ago, before Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War, 700,000 Americans died to free the slaves. I know it was to preserve the Union, but ultimately slavery was the issue. And that was followed by 100 years of Jim Crow. And it's kind of hard to believe all of this stuff, that even up to, 50 odd years ago, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it's kind of hard to believe that people would be hit with a lead pipe riding a bus, the Freedom Riders. And I know you would condemn and decry all of this. But I said to Peter, that all is undeniable. The question is whether the United States has changed, not just significantly, but dramatically since. I said to Peter, President Obama, a very talented and gifted African-American politician, defeated a white war hero, a man who was locked in a box for 5 years in Vietnam, a naval aviator, whose father was the commander of naval forces in the Pacific during the Vietnam, and then his father was an admiral as well. I mean, you're talking about absolute white American hero, and he's defeated by Barack Obama in a majority white country, and Obama enjoyed historic popularity among the American public and went out, with a high approval rating. He might even won a third election had he been allowed to, and not limited to 2 terms. So I said to Peter, doesn't all this say something? Yes, there are racist cops. I've met racists in the United States. Some of the things that I hear people say really disgust me to my core, because I'm a Jew. I'm an Orthodox Jew. Like you, I wear a yarmulke. And I'm very proud of the fact that you, as a editor-at-large at Breitbart and one of the country's truly distinguished journalists. You've won multiple awards. You're a graduate of Harvard Law School. You wear a kippah. You're a proud Jew, but you transcend the Jewish community. You contribute to the world at large. You're writing pieces for one of the most read websites in the world, et cetera, et cetera. You're a high-ranking editor there. You and I both ascribe to the Bible, chapter 1, Genesis, that God created every human being in his image. I can't imagine for a moment that you harbor a bigot or prejudiced particle in your being. So Peter would say, well, Shmuley, all of that is nice, but it's not true. The heart of America has not changed. That these police outrages actually bespeak a deep-seated racism. And I was once with Peter after one of our radio shows, where if I recall correctly, we were kind of stopped by the police who kind of asked him, who he was, et cetera. And he said to me, look, Shmuley, you see, on the other hand, Joel, you know that one of my close friends, very close friends, is Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey. He and I had a very significant difference on the Iran nuclear agreement, and subsequent to that, many differences on Israel. And I've been critical of Cory only on policy, but Cory enjoys very wide popularity among Blacks and whites and huge popularity in the Jewish community. So I have said repeatedly for decades now that the greatest American of the 20th century was Martin Luther King, who restored America to its founding principles. This country was built on this idea that we're all created in the image of God and the Declaration of Independence. And even Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that, but was a slaveholder and freed none of his slaves before he died because he had too much debt, unlike George Washington, who freed all of his slaves. Even Thomas Jefferson said that he fears for his country when he thinks that God is just and there could be this retribution, divine retribution for slavery. And that's exactly what Abraham Lincoln said in the second inaugural. So I feel America has changed dramatically. Nearly all the people that I know, not that there aren't racists that I know racists, they're disgusting. They sicken me to my stomach. But nearly all the Americans that I know are, thank God, colorblind. They love the United States. They love diversity. I said at the height of the riots, I come back from Israel from burying my father. I see a city that I love, New York City. Such a diverse city. I see the city torched and I don't understand it. I lived in Oxford and London, and I visited cities all over the world. My wife is from Sydney, Australia. There is no city like New York. New York is so diverse, and Blacks and whites live together as brothers and sisters and all flourish. So here's my core question to you. Peter Noel is going to come on the same broadcast and say in 2 nights' time, and Peter's like a brother to me, that America is a deeply racist country, that racism is in its DNA. And most of the people who demonstrated all around the United States, in their hundreds and thousands, maybe in their millions, in Washington, Los Angeles, Seattle, New York, Dallas, Houston, they believe that America is a deeply racist country. Why are they wrong?
Each of us as an individual has an incredible amount of power to choose the country we want to live in. If you want to live in a country where racism is in the DNA, you can live that way. And you can find things in your environment and in history, certainly, but even in your everyday life, that will seem to confirm that to you. If you want to live in a country where racism isn't a problem, and let me put it in a more personal way, where anti-Semitism isn't a problem, you can also live that way. And you can find ways of living where the fact that someone might look at you differently, maybe treat you differently, becomes such a minuscule event in the context of your overall experience that it doesn't actually define your experience. And one of the things I've noticed in being outwardly Jewish, wearing kippah and all that, is I never get any grief about it whatsoever. Never. The only people who ever give me a little trouble about it are Jews, to be honest. But I never get any kind of prejudice or anything like that. And
I don't mean to interrupt, forgive me. That's the irony about Breitbart, that people call Breitbart anti-Semitic. Little do they realize that one of the highest ranking editors in all of Breitbart is you, an Orthodox Jew, kippah wearing Orthodox Jew. You're one of the highest ranking people there. And Breitbart opened a bureau in Jerusalem, fought BDS nonstop. I wrote this and defended Breitbart. Okay, so yeah, I'm sorry, go on.
But, it's not that anti-Semitism doesn't exist. I mean, in 2016, there was an attack on the synagogue in Santa Monica, where my wife and I and our family go. And somebody painted swastikas with feces on the window. If you can imagine someone doing such a thing, that's what they did. And we don't know who did it, but it was unpleasant and scary. But the whole society, the whole town came to the menorah lighting that happened a week later after everything was cleaned up, and somebody donated security cameras. And the society itself is not anti-Semitic. So this thing happened. We don't know who did it. I was present in the synagogue once when somebody came in and started shouting anti-Semitic slogans. This will be ironic. They came in and started shouting "Hail Hitler," and this was an African-American individual, which is crazy because Hitler didn't like Jews or blacks for the same reason, his bizarre racial theories. So I just put it down to this person being somewhat insane or ill-educated or whatever. But I could look at that and say, oh, same thing, thousands of years of history, and I have to worry about security in my own neighborhood. I don't look at it that way. You can look at it that way for a few minutes, I suppose, but I don't live that way. And I think that we can live as if our society is irredeemably racist, that it's in our DNA. But, I want to just quote something to you that I heard recently. This is Martin Luther King Jr., the letter from a Birmingham jail. So he's writing to fellow clergy who are telling him, don't push for civil rights, just take your time, be moderate and so forth. And he's tired of being moderate and he wants to desegregate the South. And he writes, one day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for what is best in the American dream and for the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage, thereby bringing our nation back to those great wells of democracy, which were dug deep by the founding fathers in their formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. So for Martin Luther King Jr., sitting in jail because of his protest against racial discrimination in the South, the founding of the country was the answer, was not the problem. It wasn't racism that was in our DNA, it was freedom that was in our DNA. And racism was the circumstance. The Constitution was written and signed partly by slave owners. And as you pointed out, the early founding fathers had slaves, and not all of them sold their slaves. And Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, all men created equal, had slaves. So the circumstances into which our country was born were certainly circumstances that lend themselves to racism, not just at the time, but, as you pointed out very eloquently, since then, for decades, centuries. But the cure is also there. And listening to you, I actually thought of something in the Talmud. I'm trying to keep up with Daf Yomi, I do the daily Daf. And there's a very interesting digression in the middle of a discussion of the laws of the Sabbath, the laws of Shabbat, what you can carry here or there. It gets very technical. But there's a digression in the story about Moses going up Mount Sinai. And he goes up to get the Torah. After the 10 Commandments are revealed, he goes up to get the rest of the Torah from Hashem, from God. And the angels look at Moses and they say to God, what are you doing with this guy? You're not going to give your Torah to human beings. Look at these human beings. They're sinful, they're awful, they're mortal. There's so many terrible things about them. Why are you giving your Torah, this precious teaching, this divine wisdom? Why are you wasting your treasure on these people? And to make a long story short, Moses says to the angels, well, the Torah has laws about business. Are you doing business up here? The angels say no. Moses says, well, the Torah has laws about sex. Are you tempted by sex up here? No. The Torah has laws about what to eat. Do you have to eat in heaven? No. So Moses says, look, the Torah is for us. The Torah is because we have problems. This is what we need to fix our problems. The Torah has work to do in the world. It doesn't have work to do in heaven. So the Torah comes down from Mount Sinai. And in a way, it's kind of like the Constitution. I mean, the Constitution is not a perfect document, but it is inspired by, and it contains within it, timeless truths about individual liberty. And therefore, even though it allowed slavery to continue, and even though it was born in this environment where Black people were treated as less than human beings, within the Declaration and the Constitution, there is the redeeming principle. It's a principle that over time comes to define the whole. And you look at our history, and it is a history of progress and a history of improvement. So I look at the history and I'm looking at the big picture. I'm looking at it and saying Black poverty at the lowest level ever, lowest unemployment, highest employment in the Black community. Look at everything moving in the right direction. So I understand the outrage at what happened in Minneapolis. But what's happened is people have started to make that into a statement about our society as a whole. And I feel that that does an injustice to the people who made this country better over the last several years, several decades. And that was a joint effort, even among people who disagree with each other and dislike each other as much as Donald Trump and Barack Obama probably do. There were things that both of them did that created the foundation for this prosperity. And that prosperity is the foundation for tolerance and all the good things that come with it. So we can live in that America where racism is in our DNA, but I don't think that's a happy place. And you don't have to ignore racism to live in the other America. I think the other America that you can choose to live in is the America where we get over that stuff and we learn to work with each other. And I think that's a choice that everybody has to make.
Well, I studied the same part of the Talmud. I'm also trying to do the Daf Yomi, and I like the way you have made that relevant to our current political climate. There's just things happening now that I just find like really shocking, which brings me to your book. Look, I believe in a two-party state. I believe there should be Republicans and Democrats, liberals, conservatives. I use the metaphor of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the founder of the Chabad Hasidic movement, who said that love of God and fear of God are two wings of a bird. And if both wings are on one side, the bird is just going to flop around endlessly. You actually need antithetical propulsion. So I don't want to live in China in a one-party state. I don't want to live in Putin's Russia, a one-party state. I like that we have two parties. What's troubling, and that's why people who vote Democrat, that's a very legitimate American right, and people who vote Republican, very legitimate American right. But let's go to your book. And I have not yet read your book, and I apologize both to the viewers and to you. You know, I am in a period of mourning for my father, and the book is coming out in a month, and I have not had the opportunity. But I know the basic idea. It's called Red November, and it's about whether the United States this coming November is going to choose socialism, a red socialism, or a red state Trump political agenda. Which way is the United States going to go? So while I affirm, of course, the need for two parties, I guess what I find troubling, and maybe your book speaks to this, is whenever either of the two parties goes off the deep end and begins to enunciate policies that deviate from core American values. So for example, if the Republican Party did not fully and completely condemn and repudiate every scintilla of racism that we see in a bad apple cop, or if we see in a legislator, or like Congressman King, who just lost his primary. If the Republican Party went off the reservation and didn't condemn racism fully, that's a repudiation of core American values. And by the way, that was the Democratic Party for the most part in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. Conversely, when the Republican Party was very isolationist during before the Second World War, and didn't believe as much in fighting Hitler, and you had Roosevelt that was agitating for that far more. Well, you know, Hitler had to be fought. So I see certain values as transcending political partisanship, which brings me to your book. The surprising thing about some of the things that we've heard from Democratic politicians, and I'd like you to speak to this, is when you start hearing like defund the police or even demonizing the police. You can demonize racist police. And the video of what happened to George Floyd is horrific. The casual nature of a police officer with his knee on someone as he slowly loses consciousness it is shocking it shocks us to our core, and it shocked America on both sides of the aisle. But when you hear defund the police, I had a friend, dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, would never vote for a Republican. He called me yesterday and he said to me, I cannot believe that my party is speaking about defunding the police. That's anarchy. That's anarchy. And what about all the hero cops who risk their lives every single day to protect us, save us, rescue us, to demonize all of them as if they're a force for bad, for evil? It's kind of shocking. Or when you hear about the intersectionality. Do Black Lives Matter? Of course they matter, God almighty. And to the extent that America has ever made any African-American man, woman, child feel that they don't matter, that's a sin against God and against the most vital American values. But the intersectionality of demonizing Israel, which is the only democracy in the Middle East, which brought Black Jews from Ethiopia into freedom, the only example of a country falsely accused of European colonialism, bringing Black citizens to live in freedom from persecution, and it has no precedent in the annals of history. When you hear about well, let me allow you to take over, because what are you saying in the book? Why do you feel that the Democratic Party is beginning to go off, or elements of the Democratic going off the reservation?
So the book is Red November, and it's about the Democratic Party presidential primary. And I traced the very
covered, and yeah.
Right, I covered it, and I was pretty much the only conservative journalist who was there wire to wire from beginning to end. You'd see friends and colleagues from other publications pop up at different events, but I was basically there the whole way through. You can ask my wife. For a year, every single week I was in a different city. I was home for Shabbat almost every time, but during the week I was in New Hampshire, I was in South Carolina, I was in Iowa, I was in wherever the action was, that's where I was. And I followed around the candidates and went to the big events, the Iowa State Fair, so forth, and got a real sense of what this primary was about. And the stage for this primary was really set by the reaction to Donald Trump's victory in 2016 and the emergence of the resistance, so to speak, in 2017. Now, what Democrats probably should have been doing and would have been more productive to do was to sit down and ask themselves, why did we lose? Which voters did we lose? How can we get them back? And the answer to that, the most straightforward answer, is they lost a lot of voters who voted for Obama in 2008 and 2012, but switched to Trump in the Midwest. That was the area where Trump went and basically stole the core of the Democratic working class constituency and brought it over to his side. Is that a permanent shift? No, it isn't. It really is going to depend for the next few elections. But Democrats didn't ask themselves that. And there are a number of reasons they didn't, one of which is that they simply were shocked by defeat. They assumed there must have been some foul play, it must have been rigged, the Russians were involved, and people allowed themselves to run away with these conspiracy theories. But another reason was that there was internal corruption in the Democratic Party. And this was different than a typical election where the losing side in the primary generally is given a chance to lead the way the next time around. So for example, Mitt Romney lost to John McCain in 2008. So Mitt Romney got a chance in 2012. He didn't win, but Republican elections have often worked that way, and Democratic elections have often worked that way. Hillary Clinton lost to Barack Obama in 2008. So when Obama was leaving, Hillary Clinton got the nod in 2016. There's a kind of symmetry there, not perfect symmetry. What happened in 2016, though, was the Bernie Sanders campaign was robbed, essentially. Clinton probably could have won the nomination fair and square, but there was also a sense of aggrieved, of having been cheated, really, because of the revelations that came out from WikiLeaks and so forth. People forget that WikiLeaks wasn't primarily about something Democrats were doing to Republicans or hiding from Republicans. WikiLeaks was primarily about how Democrats had rigged their own primary against Bernie Sanders. And so you add the sense of having suffered an historic injustice to the idea that the establishment had tried and failed badly. And you suddenly have this momentum behind the far left that is unique in American history. And so instead of coming back to the middle and being competitive for those voters in the middle, Democrats did some of that in the midterm elections, but they really pushed to the far left. And you do see some Democrats winning in suburban districts in conservative areas, especially in California and New York, areas that got higher taxes under Trump because Trump lowered the ceiling on how much people could claim back from state and local property taxes. That's another story. But what you also saw with the emergence of Rashida Tlaib and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, these real hardcore leftists, Ilhan Omar, people who came out of districts where they couldn't be defeated once they won. Nobody will ever get rid of these politicians unless they do something corrupt, and even then they might survive. And they began to define the Democratic Party. Many of them were very well trained. They had histories as organizers, and some of them are simply very talented, like AOC is very, very skilled in social media, and she began to define the Democratic Party agenda. So by the time you arrive at the primary, you've got all these serious presidential candidates signing up for things like the Green New Deal and Medicare for all, and these policies that were so radical, they never would have gotten off the ground under Obama. I mean, you couldn't even get cap and trade passed through the Democratic Senate under Obama. You couldn't get Medicare for all under the Democratic Senate under Obama. So these were things Democrats rejected, and they were now coming back as the orthodoxy of the party. Now, Joe Biden was the one candidate who didn't embrace Medicare for all fully. He wanted Medicare for all to be a choice, not an imposition, not a requirement. But aside from that, there was nothing that distinguished him in policy terms. And in fact, he went back over his policies and moved far to the left on a lot of issues. So this primary is interesting because it became the most left-wing primary in American history. Now, some of the book is fun. I tell you stories on the campaign trail. I got into a confrontation with Joe Biden about some things he was claiming that weren't true. I got kicked out of events by Beto O'Rourke, who was part of this whole cancel culture. You know, if a conservative reporter showed up.
I wanted to address the cancel culture.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but that's
let me just
about that. Let me just finish
go
the
back
point.
one moment. So you were there covering the Democratic primaries as Breitbart editor at large. I mean, that itself must have been fascinating. I mean, did they credential you at every event?
Every event except two. One where Beto O'Rourke kicked me out. That was an event at a historically Black college. And the reason they gave was that the Black students would be intimidated by the Breitbart reporter, which was just nonsense. I mean, first of all, it wasn't the first time I'd been.
You were going to intimidate them?
Yeah, exactly. My presence in the room was.
You look very intimidating.
Exactly.
I feel intimidated just talking to you.
Right.
I feel you're intimidating me even through this 3,500 miles of computer distance.
Exactly. Now there's that, and then the only other event I wasn't credentialed for was the LGBTQ town hall with CNN. CNN gave me credentials for every other event that CNN hosted, even though Breitbart and CNN fight like cats and dogs. But the Human Rights Campaign, which was holding or hosting the LGBTQ town hall, didn't credential me. And they said it was because of limitations of space. But that was the only time. And interestingly,
even after you were credentialed, were you treated with respect? Were people warm, or were they?
Oh, well, you know, treated professionally. I mean, you know, there isn't a lot of warmth necessarily, but I certainly enjoyed talking to voters. There were places people didn't talk to me. So there were Elizabeth Warren town halls where I would interview someone and then they'd say, "Where are you from?" Or usually I told them where I'm from right up front, but they would not recognize the name. And then afterwards they'd say again, and they'd think about it and they'd say, "You know what? I don't want to talk to you actually." That happened a few times, but mostly people were pretty open. I have to say the Bernie Sanders campaign was probably the best when it came to media. Bernie Sanders was very professional when it came to credentialing. And of all the campaigns, the Sanders campaign was the most accessible from a media perspective.
Including the candidate?
The candidate was the most accessible among the front runners. Joe Biden never came to the spin room after a debate. Elizabeth Warren came a couple of times, but she tended to stay near the mainstream reporters. Pete Buttigieg never spoke to the spin room once, not even once. He had a couple interviews in the spin room, but they were prearranged with the networks. Bernie Sanders came and hung out once, and I got some good questions in. Unfortunately, then he had a heart attack about 2 or 3 weeks later. And I
hope your questions did not contribute to that.
Yeah, I hope so too. But I you know, he didn't sound very good in that spin room. I mean, I was wondering if he was ill then. So that happened, and I think he cut back his activity, but they were definitely more accessible. And his surrogates were always willing to talk. His senior advisors, Jeff Weaver and Nina Turner, they were always willing to talk, even though there was a bit of a back and forth. His campaign manager, Faiz Shakir, the first Muslim to run a campaign, you know, Orthodox Jew from a conservative publication, debating really with a left-wing Muslim, you know.
But that is America, you know.
Yeah.
I can't wait to read your book. Again, I'm speaking to Breitbart editor at large, my dear friend Joel Pollak, who edits my columns at Breitbart. We're talking about his new book, Red November, which is available for pre-order at Amazon and everywhere else where fine books are sold. Great plug there. And Joel's a very talented writer. I'm amazed, by the way, at how you knock out copies so quickly, because I'll see a story break and I'll see your take on it 20 minutes later on Breitbart. But that would be, for me, one of the most interesting parts of the book. I love when I see people of differing perspectives, differing viewpoints, just showing each other basic courtesy and respect. And it's missing today. And that'll be very interesting to me. Whatever take you have on the Democratic primaries, and I understand that you're saying that they're going off the reservation with very extreme policies and how the candidates are being pulled in that direction.
Okay.
But even just before we get to that, I'm actually really interested in the human component, because the cancel culture, it really is problematic. Before you and I sat down to talk tonight, I just read the editorial in the Wall Street Journal about what happened to James Bennett of the New York Times. I happen to like Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas very much. I thought he was extremely courageous in the letter that he wrote to Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in 2015, I believe it was, about how President Obama may do this Iran deal, but get ready, a new president will come, and with a single signature, it's gone. And that's exactly what happened. It was prophetic. And he was the only one that did it, and he got a bunch of senators to sign on. And I think, he's a military hero. And he wrote a column for the New York Times, and he said, I think we should invoke the Insurrection Act and send troops to the streets. And it has happened before. President George H.W. Bush did so after the Rodney King riots, and other presidents have done so. So it wasn't an outland, and it's American law. Now you can debate him, dispute him, repudiate him, write letters, but a dyed-in-the-wool liberal editor at the New York Times, widely respected, James Bennett, was forced to resign. It's just shocking. Or the chief editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer, who had that headline that buildings also matter. And I understand, was it the wisest headline? Probably not, because you and I are Orthodox Jews. We would never compare buildings to the importance, the infinite value of a life. In fact, that was one of the mistakes that Pope Pius XII made during the Holocaust. He never objected to the murder of approximately 10,000 Jews per day for 4 years during the Holocaust by the Germans in the extermination camps. But when the battle for Rome was about to take place, and General Mark Clark, the American commander, was going to eviscerate Rome unless the Germans surrendered, suddenly Pope Pius XII found his voice. And he said, you can't bomb Rome and St. Peter's Basilica and all the great churches and St. John of the Lateran and all these great churches. And he's been rightly criticized. Wait a second, when 10,000 Jews were being killed every day, you didn't say a flipping word, but to protect your churches, you found your voice. So I understand why the headline was offensive. Okay, so say that, and he should be forced to publish a hard-hitting op-ed that says that what he did was disgusting. That's part of what dialogue, but forced out of his job, fired. So what I'd be very interested in hearing about is these exchanges that you had. And I'm not surprised to hear that Bernie's campaign was the most open, because when I was the rabbi at Oxford University for 11 years, so Bernie Sanders' brother, Larry Sanders, was a regular at my Friday night Shabbat dinner. For a few years, almost every Friday night, and we became very close. And he and I disagreed utterly on politics, especially on Israel. He's a proud Jew, big critic of Israel, as is Bernie, as is his brother. But we always talked, and there was great love between us and great warmth, and we shared so many Shabbat dinners. And Joel, that's the way it's supposed to be. How did it come to this? The demonization. That's what I can't stand. It's the demonization. It's the inability to speak. It's saying Breitbarts are all anti-Semites, and then this group are all this, and very offensive. And it's destroying our ability to even talk to each other.
So if I were writing that headline in the Philadelphia Inquirer, I wouldn't have said buildings matter. I would have said institutions matter. And what we saw over the last week or so with these riots was an attack on institutions, more than an attack on people. And I will never forget the site I saw in Santa Monica, which I went to the morning after the riots. I went to the downtown, and I will never forget the sight of the graffiti on the library. And the graffiti said, "Save a life, kill a cop," on the library. Okay. It's not a store. It's not the police station. It's not even a courthouse or the city hall. It's the library. Now, the people who work at the library, they spend all day dealing with homeless people who come in from the cold or from the street, black, white, whatever. These are people who give their lives to those who have nothing. And it's a free public resource. You can drop out of high school, theoretically, and educate yourself at a library for nothing. The library is the foundation of our society. It's the preservation of wisdom. It's the preservation of freedom, free thought. And that's what they attacked. So I understand what the editor's saying. The building isn't important. It's what's in the building. It's the books. And it's also what the building represents. It's the shared commitment to liberating every generation from ignorance and poverty, because everybody can learn from a library. And even if you don't rely entirely on a library for your education, and nobody should have to in a wealthy country like ours, but you can always fill in a gap. You can learn a new skill. You can meet other people, bring children to a library, teach children to read. So this is what they attacked. This was a completely nihilistic march. I understand a lot of people who participated in that march in Santa Monica on May 31st were peaceful and they want to express their outrage at what happened to George Floyd. But then the looters came, and the organizers, I'm sorry, they have to be held accountable to some extent. The organizers did not make a plan to work with law enforcement, to have monitors, to have a parade route, to have certain streets closed off. This is what happens when you just show up somewhere and say peaceful protest, peaceful protest. Peaceful protest is great. Lawful protest is better, because then you can arrange with your fellow citizens who are going to be inconvenienced if you block a road and so forth. So they didn't organize this, and they allowed the legitimate part of the protest to be used as cover by the looters and the Antifa thugs who smashed the store windows, graffitied the library. I am personally aware of at least 2 businesses I know of in that area that was ransacked by the looters and utterly destroyed. Businesses that were owned by minorities, people who theoretically Black Lives Matter would march to defend, instead of which they were putting rocks through the window. I will never forget that. And also, I am not forgiving it. And I'm not forgiving it because nobody has apologized for it. There's nobody who has yet said, this was wrong, we should not have done it. Instead, all I've heard for 2 weeks are people justifying this rioting, or the media covering up for it by saying mostly peaceful, mostly peaceful. Most violent events are mostly peaceful. A person can spend 99% of their lives being a law-abiding citizen, but when they pull the trigger and shoot an innocent person, they become a murderer subject to the death penalty, and it's a split second, but their lives were mostly peaceful. This is a euphemism that they're using to avoid talking about what actually happened. And that's the extent to which I think, and you get to this comes back to the book, what's happened to the Democratic Party. And I actually wrote about this today. We're experiencing in the Black Lives Matter movement and in the Democratic primary process, an American cultural revolution. It's America's version of China's cultural revolution, where we have young people destroying things merely because they exist, merely because they are old, merely because they are traditional, because they carry connotations of authority. We have people attacking the libraries, attacking the police, attacking the schools, attacking the Constitution, attacking gender, attacking whatever it is that comes to hand to attack. And the adults in the room are powerless to stop it. They're powerless and they're afraid of it, so they won't stop it. So that's why you see the Democrats running away from defund the police. I mean, Joe Biden gave a sort of half-hearted statement through a spokesman that he disagrees with defunding the police, but they're all basically avoiding the issue. They're terrified of what they've created, and what they've created is a generation of young people that believes, to get back to our first point, that their society is fundamentally flawed, rather than that their society is a flawed society, as all societies are, but fundamentally good. And that the job of our society is to redeem that society, to use what works in America to fix what doesn't in America, rather than writing off the whole. And this process of losing control really has only one solution, and that's defeat. The only way to stop it is to defeat it. That's why Americans in 1968 went to the polls and elected Richard Nixon rather than Hubert Humphrey, or in the primary, unfortunately, of course, Robert Kennedy was assassinated, by the way, by a radical Palestinian terrorist. People forget that part. But
who hated Robert F. Kennedy because he was a great supporter of Israel.
correct. And people reacted to that shock and the disintegration of institutions and law and order by voting for the law and order president, Richard Nixon. Of course, ironically, Nixon then went on to break the law. But Americans want stability right now. And I think, to give him some credit, I think Joe Biden understands that, or understood it at one point. But he is powerless to stop what's happening in his party. And you can see it in the changes he's making constantly to his own positions. So before, in the early part of the Democratic primary, he said he wants a middle of the road approach to climate change. Most people would agree with that. You could probably find most Republicans who would agree with it. But then AOC said, there's no room for a middle ground on climate change. That's what she said. So now he gave into that. He said he wants to eliminate all fossil fuels after running on clean coal with Barack Obama in 2008. Now Biden wants to get rid of all fossil fuels, and he's appointed AOC one of his climate advisors. He is powerless to control this. Now, he could still win anyway, and if people are upset enough about Trump, he could still win. And that's the point in the book. I basically say, look, the country has never had a starker choice, because Democrats are being completely honest with what are socialist policies. That's what they are, on the one hand. And then you have Trump, on the other hand, who has turned out to govern as probably the most conservative president, if not since Ronald Reagan, maybe since even before Ronald Reagan, since Calvin Coolidge. And you've got a choice between red and red, the red states of Donald Trump, or the red socialism of Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. And it's an interesting, whimsical way to look at the election. And I do think that we're probably going to be okay as a country. But I also think that the challenge, and I write about this in the book, the challenge of this march to the left is going to be with us no matter who wins. Trump cannot defeat it with one victory. It's going to take several defeats for that side of the party to realize that it needs to do something else. That's why we got Bill Clinton in the 90s, because after Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale and Michael Dukakis, finally Democrats decided, you know what, maybe we need to stop electing liberals and start electing moderates. We need to start electing people who are a little bit more to the middle. And Clinton won, and he was able to achieve almost everything liberals wanted, but do it in a moderate way. People on both sides of the aisle would concede that Clinton was largely a successful president. They'll quibble with this thing he did or that. And of course, the impeachment and the Monica Lewinsky drama was not good. It probably actually led to some of the problems we have today. It's a topic for another time. But in many ways, he was a successful president because he accepted some of what the country had decided under Reagan. Obama rejects what Reagan achieved. He wanted to be the next Reagan on a liberal side in undoing Ronald Reagan's legacy. Most of the Democratic candidates reject Ronald Reagan's legacy completely. What was Ronald Reagan's legacy? It's the legacy Trump has picked up, which is that America is a force for good. That's basically what Ronald Reagan stood for. Ronald Reagan was a New Deal Democrat whose party abandoned him. Reagan believed in FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, who you mentioned. Reagan believed that government had a duty to establish a floor beneath which nobody could fall. There had to be a safety net. That was Ronald Reagan. He accepted Roosevelt, but added on the small government ideas of Barry Goldwater and Arthur Laffer and F.A. Hayek and Margaret Thatcher. So Ronald Reagan reduced what government shouldn't do from the conservative point of view, but strengthened what it should. And so Reagan was remembered as a successful president because he also accepted certain things that came before. Obama rejected Reaganism. He liked the example of Reagan as a transformative figure, but he rejected Reaganism. And every Democratic candidate running in 2020 rejects Trumpism, not realizing that one of the reasons, or many of the reasons, that Trump won have to do with the fact that Trump is representing the legitimate will of the American people to get back to certain values that were once taken for granted, like having borders, for example, like having a foreign policy that is not adventurous and that only uses the military when necessary. These are principles that were largely forgotten in Washington. And Democrats would probably agree with some of that foreign policy, although Democrats go too far in the other direction of appeasement, which I know you and I talk about a lot with regard to the Obama administration. That's unfortunately the foreign policy for a lot of the Democrats coming in. But Democrats basically think that a lot of this patriotism stuff, a lot of traditional religious culture is worthless. And you've seen it recently in the shutdowns. It's a travesty that you have supermarkets open, but churches unable to open.
Well,
And
and look at
yeah,
look at what we've witnessed in New York, where Mayor de Blasio was condemning the Jewish community by name for funerals. And
right,
if he had been consistent, okay, so he could say, I know honoring the dead is extremely important. And I'm speaking now from personal experience. I traveled all the way to Israel to bury my father on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem because it's a son's obligation to do so. It was unthinkable to me that I would not have done that. Some of the most moving verses in the Bible for me are where you have Isaac and Ishmael who didn't get along, but they come together to bury Abraham, and
yeah,
you had Esau and Jacob. They don't get along, but they come together to bury Isaac. But it was unthinkable. And if de Blasio had at least been consistent, saying, sorry, everything in public is not going to happen. But of course, the demonstrations were fine, but he condemned the Jewish community, and all of us are sitting there scratching our heads, saying, the police are breaking up, Orthodox Jewish women taking their kids to like the parks and putting them on swings, while
right.
tens of thousands of people are marching. But it's only a few minutes.
I've got just a brief example of that. It's even more poignant, which I know you'll relate to. There's a guy in my shul here who lost his mother during the coronavirus, so they couldn't have Shiva because of coronavirus. He gets back to LA, or he's in LA because he can't go travel, whatever. And his store gets looted by a crowd that has no concern whatsoever about social distancing, that is part of a movement that everybody is praising and saying you should go out there, the mayor comes out and takes a knee with them or whatever. So he couldn't go to his mother's Shiva or funeral, and his store gets looted by this crowd. You talk about the irony of the situation. And look, Abigail Schreier, a friend of mine, had a great point in the Wall Street Journal, which is maybe these riots wouldn't have happened if people could have gone to church, if they could have had some spiritual guidance. Remember, there's a right from a wrong.
Interesting. That's interesting.
That's why
Well,
Trump
let's,
the Bible.
in the last few minutes remaining to us,
Yeah.
about like 2 minutes, let's just focus on the right and wrong aspect. That's an interesting point that I have not heard made. Firstly, Joel, let me just say, again, speaking to my dear friend Joel Pollak, he is my editor of the columns I publish at Breitbart. You see why I say this. Believe me, when you lose a parent, you're in a very introspective and reflective mood. So I say this to you with all sincerity, that words that emanate from the heart penetrate the heart. In speaking to you and hearing you, Joel, I see why you're one of the country's top and most respected writers. Your insight, your balance, your intelligence, your command of the facts, your historical knowledge, and your ability to weave it into one compelling tapestry of conviction is impressive. So let's end with right and wrong. My biggest problem with everything that's happened over the past 2 weeks in the United States, and it really started almost at the same time that my father passed away in Los Angeles. So I was kind of out of it for a while. I was just focusing on the need to organize the very challenging logistics during the coronavirus of burial and all the things that you said, the mourning rituals, and especially a transcontinental burial in the Holy Land of Israel. But all of this was happening, and as I'm sitting Shiva in Israel, and as I'm burying my father, I'm beginning to hear about the George Floyd murder, and then the riots and the looting, and it pained me so much. And then I came back and actually saw it. So I want to conclude with your comment on this idea of right and wrong. As I said, there will always be, hopefully in America, right and left. There will always be Democrats and Republicans. I don't want to see a one-party state. You're saying that the Democratic Party isn't the left anymore. It's the extreme left. And therefore, you say in your book, Red November, that we're going to have to choose between a Trump red and a socialist red. And you made the point that it's largely because we see people like Rashida Tlaib, who's an anti-Semite. Sadly, I say that with no pleasure in my heart at all. I would have loved to have seen a Palestinian American woman elected to public office and champion human rights and speak about and condemning Hamas for their atrocities against the Palestinian people and condemning the corruption of Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority and the kleptocracy that he's running, and the wholesale theft of the Palestinian Authority against innocent Palestinians who deserve a high quality of living, but instead they get the dictatorship of Mahmoud Abbas. I would have loved to have seen her prosper and succeed as an American politician. I would have, of course, welcomed the same. with Ilhan Omar, who another a true anti-Semite. Sadly, I would have loved to have seen a woman from Somalia, an immigrant to this country, flourish as a great American woman and as an elected official in espousing great American values. Instead, she has betrayed American values with her disgusting anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitic tropes of Jews and money and Jews and their power, and just disgusting, straight out of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And you're saying that they've come to dominate the agenda in the Democratic Party. Let's just end, I'm sorry for this long-winded thing. Let's just end with this whole discussion of right and wrong. I feel that people on the right, Republicans, must condemn completely and utterly, without any buts and without any reservations, the abomination of what happened to George Floyd. And I feel that people on the left have to condemn completely and utterly. And although it is to a lesser extent, because murder is, we believe in the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments, murder is the worst thing, of course, taking a life. But condemn, albeit to a lesser extent, but condemn completely the abomination of looting, burning cities, violence. Martin Luther King went back to Memphis in 1968, and he's murdered by a white racist, James Earl Ray, at 6:01 p.m. on the 4th of April, 1968, because he goes back to Memphis after having gone for the sanitation strike. But he in the first march, he was humiliated. He felt personally humiliated. There was violence, that windows were smashed, and his essence was nonviolent. So he goes back a second time, and this time is the organizer of the march, exposing him to an assassin's bullet, and he's murdered 52 years ago, because he so hated violence that he couldn't close the chapter on Memphis until he marched without violence. I feel we're losing that in America. The inability of the right to completely and utterly condemn that which is wrong when it happens, and the ability of the people on the left to completely condemn that which is wrong, meaning we're undermining our values, and we're not going to have a United States of America. So I complete our discussion. I'll give you the final word the way I started it. I lost my father. I need comfort, and I see a country I so love ripped apart, and I think it's because we're losing a sense of right and wrong, this broken moral compass. So please comment on that.
I agree with it. I think you spoke about it very eloquently. I've heard people quoting Martin Luther King Jr. a lot in the last week or so, and they're misquoting him. They quote a speech he gave in Michigan a few weeks before he was assassinated. And he said, "A riot is the voice of the unheard." He did say that, but he wasn't condoning rioting. He said that in the context of saying that you should not riot and you should commit to nonviolence. He called it militant nonviolence. So even for a radical political purpose, you should be nonviolent. He didn't want to condemn rioting without also condemning the conditions in which people were living. So he felt he had to tell both sides of the story, but he was not going to participate in or condone in any moral sense what happened when rioting broke out. And so I think people have forgotten that. We have failed as a country to transmit the lessons of the civil rights struggle to people. And that's why people don't know in the political sense, right versus wrong. People are unable to morally distinguish between a peaceful protest and a riot. That's a big problem. That's a big moral problem. The media are going after Trump for his walk across Lafayette Park and standing in front of the church with a Bible. When I saw Trump do that, I felt that moment was the moment for which he was elected. That moment, I felt like he had rebooted the whole system, that he went to the source and reminded people what our country is based on. You don't have to believe in that book. I don't believe the New Testament is the revealed word of God. It's not my religion, but it is a book. And it contains my book, but it doesn't have to contain my book. If I were a Muslim, I could relate to the topic, could relate to the idea. He was holding up a Bible as a symbol of a country based on a word, based on words, based on ideas, based on a written covenant among human beings, and based on the idea that there is a God, in a sense. You don't have to believe in the God, but there's an idea of right and wrong. And we express that through words, not through strength. And he did it, and there's a whole set of photographs of him in front of the sign in front of the church. But then he moved and he stood deliberately in front of the burnt out part of the church. And that to me was saying what I think the Philadelphia Inquirer editor was trying to say, but didn't. Because there was actually a reform rabbi, who commented negatively on Trump's appearance. And she said, I want you just to notice that Trump is using the church as a symbol for his movement. This is a dangerous moment because he's using the church as a symbol. I said, no, the burned out church is the symbol of the mob. That actually symbolizes them. The damage behind him, that symbolizes the destruction that they did. What symbolizes Trump is the Bible, not because he's a religious person, and we can go over, all the ways in which he's fallen short, and he'll admit he fell short. But the principle he was illustrating was that the word survives the building. The building is there for the word, not the other way around. And there is a right and a wrong. And I felt like that's what he was standing for. That's the line he was drawing. There is a line between peaceful protest and rioting, and you have to tell the difference. The essence of what Dr. King did, which was based on a completely different religion, based on Mahatma Gandhi, based on Hindu concepts and the notion of what he called satyagraha, which was being able to see the humanity of the other person and having them see yours. That was the genius behind nonviolent protest, because when you protested nonviolently, you appeal to the humanity of the person you're trying to convince. That's why King was successful. He appealed to people using a common sense of what was right and wrong. And that's what's been lost, the idea that there is a common sense. And that's why I say we're in this cultural revolution moment when the left is attacking basics like right versus wrong. It started, decades ago, and you and I have been fighting this battle forever on campus with the anti-Israel stuff on campus. When I saw anti-Israel stuff on campus, I realized that the root of it wasn't even anti-Israel rhetoric, it was anti-American rhetoric. It was teaching people that society was rigged by the rich and there was no way the poor could ever get ahead in America, what an evil, terrible place America was. It was taking out the moral content of life. And there's only hope for us in a society where there is right or wrong. You can't convince people to agree with you unless you can appeal to their sense of right and wrong. And so that's what we've lost, and that's what has to be restored. And beyond this political moment, that's what we have to get back to. Whether we have Red November for socialism or Red November for Republican conservatism, we're going to deal with this problem for a while. This is a problem we're stuck with for a generation. And we have to rethink our educational institutions. We have to rethink our culture to some extent, and we have to find ways of reaching out to each other. And it's important to have the conversations where we disagree. And I actually spoke to George Floyd's lawyer yesterday, and we had some questions. It's important to have those conversations. And I found him to be a very decent man who actually shared a lot of the same ideas. We had different conclusions about the world because we had different experiences. But those are the conversations we have to have because we actually have a common sense of what's right and wrong. And there's hope for a relationship even across political boundaries. What I worry about is that someone who doesn't have his education and his experience, someone who's, let's say, not practicing law, although look at we have these two lawyers who threw a Molotov cocktail into a police car in New York. We've lost our way when we've forgotten what distinguishes a peaceful protest from a violent protest. And that's where Dr. King, I think, really is someone we should return to and study more than we have.
Well, Joel, you've shown us all tonight why you're truly one of America's most talented writers, and always informative and always interesting and extremely decent. By the way, I just wanted to say how much I, as an Orthodox Jew who kind of operates in mainstream society, or at least attempts to, how much I admire your very proud Jewish commitment at all times, and how you celebrate your Jewish identity, and how you proudly stand up for Israel and for human rights. And on that note, I should just say that since you mentioned about Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, I never cared about the Monica Lewinsky story. I saw it as a personal issue between Bill Clinton and his God and his wife and et cetera. What I cared about is, speaking about Black Lives Matter, is that the greatest slaughter of Black lives in modern history was in the Rwandan genocide. of April to June of 1994, and 330 African men, women, and children were macheted to death every hour in the fastest slaughter of humanity in the history of the world, faster even than the Holocaust and faster even than the Hungarian. 550,000 Hungarian Jews died in 3 months in 1944, but 880,000 Africans were murdered, Tutsis for the most part, in Rwanda. And Clinton wouldn't even meet with his senior staff, didn't even have a single meeting with senior staff. And let's not forget that it was Susan Rice, who would become President Obama's national security advisor, who famously said, when they had a meeting about whether we should intervene in Rwanda, again, the greatest slaughter of Black lives in modern history, maybe of all time, the fastest slaughter. It was Susan Rice who famously said that before we do any kind of military intervention, we have to discuss how it will affect the 1994 midterm congressional elections.
Right.
And Samantha Power, who would become Obama's ambassador at the UN, who revealed the comment. She's the one who revealed that Susan Rice had said that in her Pulitzer Prize winning 2001 book, A Problem from Hell, about genocide. So, we can't forget all that. This is not a Republican or Democratic issue. There was a Democratic president who did absolutely nothing in the greatest slaughter of innocent Black lives in modern history. And they were allowed to die because they had no oil. Nobody gave a damn about them. They were poor Africans and nobody cared. And the UN and Kofi Annan, who would later become Secretary General at the time, he was the leader of the UN peacekeeping forces. He actually ordered, and he was a man. He was obviously a Black leader, highly respected, and yet he ordered a white general, General Romeo Dallaire, a French Canadian, to stand down and not stop the genocide, because he had enough soldiers under his command to have stopped. Because it was a low-tech genocide. It was done with machetes, and they were a highly armed. Small but well-armed army, as General Dallaire tells in his incredible book, Shaking Hands with the Devil. So these are all facts. And I don't say this to score points, political points. I say this because we have to look at the facts. When Black lives don't matter, it could be Republicans who are guilty of it. It could be Democrats who are guilty of it. It's not political. The commandment not to murder is biblical. It's in the 10 Commandments. This is a universal code of ethics to which we are all bound. And since you mentioned the Daf Yomi, we also studied last week that Mount Sinai, the Talmud says, as you and I studied last week, that it's the mountain of hatred, because the Jews started becoming hated by the world by espousing this code of ethics. Anti-Semitism came into the world after the giving of the 10 Commandments, but it also says that Mount Sinai is called Chorev, which means the mountain of destruction. And the Talmud says, because if you don't follow the 10 Commandments, that brings destruction to the world. And those are the right and wrong principles that all of us have to ascribe to, that transcend politics, transcends partisanship. And I so celebrate that you wear, as a nationally celebrated journalist, you wear a yarmulke that shows that no matter what you're writing, no matter what your political orientation, no matter what your political philosophy, that yarmulke transcends it. It rises above it. And that's why I so respect you. So the book is called Red November. It's available for pre-order on Amazon. I know it's going to be a great read because you're such a talented writer. And Joel, I thank you for your friendship. You and I are very dear friends. And I love seeing you and your family when I sometimes go to Santa Monica. And please give your wife our warmest regards. And please thank her for allowing us to borrow you for what has it now been like.
Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity.
I was looking at some of the comments on Facebook, and one guy wrote at the top, he said, I haven't heard a conversation this informative in the longest time, because the ability for two people, and you and I agree on many things, we disagree on some things, but the ability to exchange ideas in a mutually respectful way in a country that has just seen so much destruction and violence and death is something that we have to return to. So God bless you, and I hope the book is a huge success.
You too, and I wish you long life, as we say.
Thank you. God bless you.